There's this really complex legal rule out there that quietly affects millions of us, whether we realize it or not. I'm talking about everything from writing a will to starting a business. It's called the unauthorized practice of law. And it can be pretty confusing. But understanding it is actually more important than ever. So let's dive in and break down what it is and why it really matters to all of us.
All right, so let's start with a situation that's probably going to feel super familiar, because honestly, this is where all the confusion really begins.
The answer for most of us is probably yes, right? You see these standard legal forms everywhere, office supply stores all over the internet. And they seem simple enough, but as you're about to see, they can open up a surprising can of worms.
So picture this. You're just trying to be a good neighbor, right? Helping someone out with one of those pre-printed documents. You're not pretending to be a lawyer or anything. You're just reading the instructions out loud, maybe explaining a tricky phrase and pointing to the line where they need to sign. Seems totally harmless.
But here's the kicker. Were you just breaking the law? Shockingly, the answer might be yes. See, according to guidance from state bar associations, the very moment you switch from just, filling in the blanks to actually guiding someone's choices on that form, you may have just crossed a very serious legal line. Okay, so that leads us to the big question here. What does it actually mean to practice law? Because the answer, it's not nearly as black and white as you'd probably think. So at its very core, the unauthorized practice of law, or UPL for short, is all about stopping people who aren't licensed lawyers from giving out legal advice. Now, these rules aren't new. They were mostly set up by state bar associations more than 100 years ago. And the official reason? To protect all of us, the public, from getting bad info from people who just aren't qualified.
Okay, so some things are pretty obvious, right? Only a lawyer can represent you in court. No brainer. But then there's this huge, messy gray area. We're talking about everyday stuff like drafting a document, filling out a form, or even just explaining what a legal term means. Depending on exactly how you do it, you could be crossing that line. And that ambiguity, that fuzziness, that's really at the heart of this whole debate.
Right, so here in the U.S., it's the Bar Association in each state that gets to make and enforce these rules. And their argument is pretty straightforward. They say, look, practicing law isn't simple. It takes a ton of skill and knowledge. Lawyers, they're educated, they're tested, they have malpractice insurance, and they're held to a really strict code of ethics. So these UPL rules, from their perspective, are just there to make sure that when you get legal help, it's from someone who actually meets all those high standards. But, and this is a big but, that brings us to the core of the conflict here. Are these rules really just about protecting you and me? Or is there maybe something else going on behind the scenes?
The whole debate really boils down to this one major tension. On one side, you have the public protection argument. These rules make sure advice comes from trained, regulated, accountable professionals. But on the other side, you have the professional gatekeeping argument. Critics say, hold on a second. They argue that these rules actually create a monopoly for lawyers, which means less competition, less innovation from new technology, and, you guessed it, higher prices. It can put even basic legal help completely out of reach for a lot of people. And that skeptical view is captured perfectly in this really provocative quote from the famous judge Richard Posner. He called the legal profession, and I'm quoting here, a cartel of providers whose focus is to restrict entry. Whoa! Calling it a cartel, he's basically saying they use their power to keep other people out, which keeps incomes high for lawyers. It's a really powerful critique that just cuts right to the heart of the whole controversy.
Okay, so this all brings us back down to earth, to a very practical question. If you're a paralegal, or a financial advisor, or even an online legal tech company, how do you actually help people without accidentally breaking the law? Well, the answer comes down to one absolutely critical distinction. This right here. This is probably the single most important concept to get. The line in the sand. It's the critical difference between providing factual, objective, legal information versus giving subjective, personal, legal advice. One is generally okay, the other is a big no-no. And getting this distinction right, it's everything. So let's break that down. Think of information as being like a librarian. It's educational, it's factual. You can point someone to the right aisle, you can provide a blank form, you can explain what the court rules are. That's all information. Advice, on the other hand, is like being a doctor writing a prescription. It's subjective. It's telling someone what they should do.
The minute you recommend which specific legal option to take or interpret how a law applies to their personal situation, bam, you've just crossed over the line into giving legal advice.
So how do non-lawyer professionals and these tech companies stay on the right side of this tricky line? Well, they have a pretty clear three-step playbook. First, disclaimers, disclaimers, disclaimers. They make you sign something that says you understand they are not giving legal advice. Second, they often use questionnaires to see how complex your situation is. If it gets too messy, they have a system to refer you to a real lawyer. And third, they make you confirm that all the information you put into a form is your own choice, your own decision.
All right, and this whole conversation gets even more important when we look at the future, because technology is completely changing how we get help with, well, pretty much everything, and that includes legal services.
Just let this number sink in for a second. 76%. In a staggering 76% of civil court cases in the United States, at least one person is in there representing themselves. That is what's known as the access to justice gap. The reality is, most people just can't afford a lawyer for common legal problems, and they're left trying to figure out this incredibly complex system all by themselves.
And this giant gap is exactly what legal tech companies are trying to fill. These services that help you create documents or find legal information, they're walking a very, very fine line. And they stay compliant pretty much the same way we just talked about. They use super clear disclaimers, they focus only on providing information and generating documents based on your choices, they have actual lawyers help design and check their systems, and they have clear pathways to refer you to a real attorney if your problem gets too complicated. Which leaves us with one final massive question for the future. You know, as AI gets more and more sophisticated, it's going to get even better at blurring that line between information and advice. So what do we do? How do we update these 100-year-old rules to keep protecting people from bad advice while also making sure we can use these incredible new tools to make sure justice isn't just a luxury available only to those who can afford it? That right there is the huge challenge we're all facing.